Alright, you scum, suit up!
Welcome back, I'm Captain Xavier, and the big HVZs are finally coming back, so I figured I'd do some advice videos to help those of you who have never been to one, who haven't been to one in a while, which definitely includes me. And I'm going to start by talking about minimalist or backup loadouts, depending on what target audience you fall into. There's really kind of two target audiences I'm going for with this video. One, people who want to put together a minimal but functional HVZ loadout. They don't want fancy stuff, they don't want to spend a lot of money, and they want to make sure that they can take this loadout anywhere and not have to worry about it running afoul of any restrictions or other problems that might befall a more fancy loadout. The other target audience are people with really fancy loadouts. Really, heavily modified blasters, both internally and externally, full weird tactical gear loadouts, and all of that. Those loadouts can run afoul of any number of problems, and so this is advice to have a backup loadout for the worst case scenario. Hopefully your primary loadout, the big fancy one, will be allowed. I obviously fall into that category. My loadout for 2022 is going to be ridiculously fancy, and I will be showing it all off, and I'm looking forward to that. But I will be bringing a backup loadout just in case something goes horribly wrong. So my recommendation guidelines for your minimalist and or backup loadout are springers or stringers only. No battery-powered blasters, and obviously no HPA or LPA blasters. Minimum internal modifications, and actually whatever the FPS cap for the event is, I recommend trying to be 20 FPS under that at least. Most of the big HVZs cap at 120 nowadays, so aim for it at most 100 FPS, probably lower. In fact, you might even consider stock blasters only. Next, minimum cosmetic modifications. Again, I highly recommend stock if at all possible, or at the very least, minimal modifications that will pass as stock. And finally, minimal tack gear. No tack vests, no mag pouches, the least you can possibly get away with and still have your loadout be functional. Now I'm going to show you my minimalist backup loadout, and then I will explain why I have each of these guidelines. And there it is, my minimalist backup loadout. And for those of you that have a really good memory, you might recognize that this is only a step down from my old primary loadout, and you would be correct. This is basically what I ran at End War and PSU and OSU and all the other various HVZs that I went to between like 2018 and 2020. I was able to go to one HVZ in 2020 before it all got shut down. But this is an absolutely functional HVZ loadout. I've got an Elite Alpha Trooper with an Orange ModWorks kit. It'll hit right about 100 FPS. It does actually have a 3D printed barrel attachment lug. I built this before the AccuTrooper came out. Running 22 round worker mags, simple Nerf sling. Very, very excellent primary for HVZ. My secondary is an Orange ModWorks hammer shot. I've got the 6-round cylinder, trigger, and hammer. Very, very nice. On my belt, I've got a dump pouch, a water bottle pouch, and in a pocket I've got 2 extra magazines. And I would have absolutely no problem running this in any HVZ, no matter how big it was or how fancy. This is a completely functional HVZ loadout. Now you can trade out the blaster for any number of other blasters. I've got videos on what make good HVZ blasters, things like the Villainator or the Artemis or the Hades, anything that's spring-powered, high capacity, and very reliable and accurate up to at least 25 feet. Makes a good backup primary. So let's go back and talk about all the guidelines that I had for this loadout. The first one I said was springer or stringer only. And why did I say that? Why did I say no battery-powered blasters and no HPA and LPA? Well, the HPA and LPA is obvious. A lot of college campuses aren't going to allow those at all for various reasons. So having a springer backup just in case they don't like your HPA, LPA setup is just a good idea. For battery-powered blasters, they can have issues in extreme weather. Now, I have nerfed in the rain, I have nerfed in the snow, I have nerfed in extreme heat, I have nerfed in extreme cold. And I have noticed that the really fancy high-end blasters tend to have more trouble than the simpler, less modified blasters, just because they have fewer things to go wrong. You also wouldn't want to run, say, an FDL-3 in a Georgia thunderstorm. It's just a bad idea. You're just asking for it to get shorted out. You don't want to be running LiPo in that kind of weather. It's just not a good idea. So having a really reliable spring-powered blaster as your backup is what I recommend. Reliability is the key word there. That's why I recommend, one of the reasons I recommend minimum modifications, which we'll get to. But the fancier your blaster, the more likely it is to have a catastrophic failure. I have seen all manner of catastrophic failures in the field. Someone with beautiful modified blaster, every bell and whistle you could want. Halfway through mission 1, it jams, burns on a wheel, and they had no backup and they die, and they got tagged. I've seen all kinds of failures. I've seen the picture of a front end of an FDL just flying off in the middle of a round. That kind of stuff happens with the really modified stuff. You're less likely to have that with a simpler blaster. So having a simple backup is a good idea. Now, it's not to say don't bring your fancy blaster. I plan to bring all kinds of fancy blasters. But I'm gonna have a really simple backup just in case. Now, the reason I said minimum internal modifications and to try to keep it to 100 FPS or lower. Again, fewer modifications, less likely to have failures. The more tweaks you make to it, it increases the likelihood of failure. It's just the nature of the beast. This one has fairly minimal modifications, and I have never had it fail me once in the field. That's why I continue to use it. I also do maintenance on it before every big event. I open it up, check the seals, check the spring, check the catch, put it all back together again, put 100 darts through it, make sure it's still working. But the reason I recommend being 20 FPS under the cap is because you would be amazed how much of a difference environment can make to the performance of your blaster. If you tune your blaster to exactly 120 FPS in the mountains of Colorado, and then you take it to sea level in California, you'd be amazed how much of a difference it might have. Elevation, humidity, heat, all of those things can have a very serious effect on the performance. And it doesn't take much if you've got a really finely tuned blaster to throw it off. At Ragnar Oktoberfest in 2018, I believe, somebody had brought their blaster. They had tuned it and tested, and it was hitting exactly the maximum FPS at home. They brought it to California, and it was hitting 10 FPS over. And try as they might, they couldn't get it down far enough to be acceptable. So have a backup that is well below the limit, at least 20 FPS below the limit, because you're less likely to gain 20 FPS. 10 FPS, I've seen. 20 would be much less likely, and especially if you're on the lower end. If you're very unlikely to go from 100 to 125. So if the limit is 120, have a blaster that hits 100. That's just my recommendation. I would also actually recommend a completely stock blaster. There are plenty of perfectly good stock blasters that make excellent HVC primaries. Alpha Troopers, Villanators, Artemis, Hades. There's lots of options, and most of them hit. Some of the good ones hit around 100 FPS. So it's perfectly acceptable to have a stock blaster rather than any kind of modification. It definitely will be more reliable. The reason I recommend minimum cosmetic should be fairly obvious. A lot of HVZs that I've been to don't allow any cosmetic modifications whatsoever. Even this barrel lug that I have would be questionable. They might even question the fact that the cylinder is black on the end instead of orange. Those might sneak through unless someone was being real picky, but don't count on them not being picky. I've been to HVZs where last minute the administration came down with new rules saying stock blasters only. It wasn't the club's fault, it was the administration. They don't understand the game, they don't really understand what's going on. That happens, and that's why we have a backup that is far more likely to be able to get through any restrictions that get put into place. For tactical gear, I've been to HVZs that didn't allow any tack gear at all. No vests, no mag pouches, nothing. You couldn't, they might even not allow this holster. Which, if that were the case, I do have the option of ditching the belt and just putting it in the pants pocket. Hammer shots will fit nicely in pants pocket. I've been to HVZs that might have actually even had an exception with my orange camo pants and combat boots. In which case, I also usually bring a pair of khaki cargo shorts and tennis shoes with me. That's usually what I travel in because it's more comfortable. And worst case scenario, again, the Karens descend and no camo and nothing at all. I have the option of going that far down. I still have somewhere to put my hammer shots, still have somewhere to put my darts, still have a back pocket to put a water bottle in. The loadout is still completely functional. And that's the goal, is the minimalist but still functional. So that about does it. Again, always read the rules for the event. They will generally make it very clear what is and isn't allowed. If your loadout is, if you have any question that your loadout might not be allowed, have a backup that you are absolutely certain will. Have a complete backup loadout. You know, all of your gear gets left in the car and you just show up in jeans and a t-shirt, a hammer shot and an alpha trooper. Have that just in case, because I have seen people show up at HVZs with the most amazing loadouts only to be told they can't use any of it and they didn't have a backup and just had to leave. Or they had to scrounge to see what people had and ended up with, you know, original alpha troopers and a 6-round magazine because that's what was available that ended up being allowed. And again, I want to reiterate that generally those kinds of restrictions aren't coming from the club. They're coming from the administration of the college that's running the event. So getting mad at the club doesn't do any good. Don't yell at the moderators because your blaster isn't being allowed. It probably wasn't their choice. It's probably something that was forced on them or compromises that they had to make just to be able to be allowed to run the event. And giving them grief isn't a good idea. Instead, have a backup that will absolutely pass anybody's scrutiny just in case. But by all means, bring the good stuff. I am looking forward to showing off the really fancy stuff that I'm going to be bringing, but this will be in my luggage just in case. So, there's my advice. Hope this helps, and bangarang!